Okay, let's talk about some plate tectonic basics and then review some of Earth's major plate tectonic settings. This color-coded map shows our current understanding of the layout of the major tectonic plates. And while it looks like a relatively simple map, it is based on decades of research. Plate tectonic activity is a sure sign that Earth is a geologically active planet, as represented by volcanic eruptions like Mount St. Helens in 1980. This activity ultimately is due to heat within the Earth that is trying to escape, and this heat has broken the rigid outer layer, the lithosphere, into different tectonic plates. And these plates are all moving around relative to each other. Here's a simplified map showing the distribution of plates and their various movement directions. Describing the movement of heat within the mantle is a little bit more complicated, and we have different models to try to explain this. Here are three. One is the typical mantle convection model with convection cells in the mantle showing the movement of heat. It could be large convection cells like this at deeper levels and smaller ones at more shallow levels. We have mantle plumes that are carrying heat from the core mantle boundary to much more shallow levels than even the surface. Could be more complicated like this, where the core mantle boundary is a complex situation where heat is traveling around in different directions. This plate tectonic activity has been occurring for billions of years, and we know this because there are rocks and structures that date way back until the earliest history of the Earth. Indeed, the Earth has a diverse geologic history as a result of this plate tectonic activity. Seismology is one discipline within geophysics that helps us understand what's going on within the interior of the Earth. Seismology is a study of earthquakes and the seismic waves they produce. And this research has helped to create and advance the theory of plate tectonics since the late 1960s. By studying earthquakes and where they occur, we have built a scientific model explaining Earth's geological activity. Most earthquake activity is concentrated in certain areas around the world. These earthquake belts typically represent boundaries between moving lithospheric plates or tectonic plates. Earth's lithosphere is broken into these plates, which are all moving around in different directions. Seismic tomography can tell us what these plates are doing at depth. We get a three-dimensional picture, and so this data here at the bottom can be used to create a simple geologic model like this, which shows an oceanic plate which is subducting beneath a continental plate. Here again is a map showing Earth's major tectonic plates. You can see the North American plate, South American plate, Eurasian, African, Pacific, Antarctic. These are the major plates, and there are smaller ones, no less important though. The Australian plate, Philippine, Nazca, Caribbean, Arabian, Indian, etc. And then there's a whole suite of even smaller plates. Notice that the continents of some plates make up only a portion of the plate. For instance, the North American plate here includes North America, Greenland, and part of Asia, as well as the oceanic crust underneath the Arctic and Western Atlantic. Oceanic crust and continental crust combined into one lithospheric or tectonic plate. There are other tectonic plates which are wholly oceanic in composition, like the Pacific plate or the Nazca plate, Cocos plate. If you want to know more, you can click on this link here. And this is the plate tectonics page, which is full of information. And it's a fairly lengthy page with lots of links. You can see our familiar map there. And you can scroll down and read about all the different aspects of plate tectonics. So tectonic plates are lithospheric plates. Remember, the lithosphere includes the crust and the rigid part of the upper mantle. So if we have oceanic crust and rigid upper mantle, this would be a oceanic lithospheric plate, or oceanic lithosphere. If it's continental crust and cold rigid upper mantle, that will be a continental lithospheric plate, or a continental lithosphere. This shows the thickness of the lithosphere around the world, and the color scale here goes from thinner in red to thicker in green, blue, purple, that way. You can see that the ocean basins are underlain by oceanic lithosphere, which is relatively thin. It's dominantly less than 90 kilometers in thickness. Most of it is between 60 and 90 kilometers thick. It is the thinnest at mid-ocean ridges, where it is maybe 50 kilometers or less in thickness. In contrast, the continental lithosphere is much thicker and ranges anywhere between 100 kilometers in thickness to 180 kilometers or more. So these lithospheric plates override weaker asthenosphere, and that's the deeper part of the upper mantle, just below the lithosphere. The asthenosphere is weak because at these depths it is under such pressure and temperature that it actually partially melts. This 1 to 2% partial melting weakens the asthenosphere enough to allow the more rigid lithosphere to move over it. Tectonic plates interact with each other at their boundaries. Commonly, built-up tectonic stress causes a release of energy in the form of an earthquake. An earthquake focus is the origin of the energy release inside the Earth, and a map of earthquake foci helps map out the geometry of the tectonic plates at depth. Here is a map of earthquake foci in the southwestern Pacific near New Zealand, and the different colored circles represent various earthquake foci of different depths. And the scale here goes from more shallow to deeper. Orange and yellow are the more shallow ones, and then green and blue and progressively deeper purple, and then even red. This map of earthquake foci shows them to be occurring in a band, fairly linear here, and there's a progression of the different depths of the earthquake foci from more shallow focus earthquakes in the eastern part, and they get progressively deeper as you go to the west, all the way to the very deep red-colored earthquake foci. This is a typical pattern of earthquake foci that's distinctive for subduction zones. It's using this data here that allows us to build a three-dimensional model. There's the orange shallow focus earthquakes, then the deeper yellow ones, and as the plate goes deeper, the earthquakes get deeper, and there's green and blue and purple, even red. So when we see this banding and this progression of different colors, we're typically looking at data from a subduction zone. So why do tectonic plates move? The basic factors are Earth's internal heat and gravity. And there are several driving forces involved in the movement of tectonic plates. The first is something called slab pull, and this is the pulling force exerted by the cold, downgoing, subducting part of a plate on the rest of the plate. You can essentially think of a subducting plate as an anchor that is pulling on the rest of the plate as it subducts down into the mantle. This is likely the dominant force involved in driving plate movement. We know this from measuring rates of movement of various plates. Movement of plates that are subducting is an order of magnitude greater than where they are not subducting. So in the Pacific Ocean basin, the rates of plate movement are 10 centimeters a year or so. The Pacific is ringed by subduction zones, whereas in the Atlantic Ocean basin, the rates of plate movement are a few centimeters a year, and there are just two relatively minor subduction zones in the Atlantic. This is pretty obvious proof showing that where subduction exists, the rates of plate movement are much higher. Another mechanism is that of ridge push. This is a force exerted at mid-ocean ridges where newly formed oceanic crust is pushing aside older crust in either direction. The contribution of ridge push in plate tectonic movement is probably minimal. And as I said, that data from the rates of plate movement in the Atlantic Ocean basin, where rates of plate motion are only a few centimeters a year, pretty much say that ridge push is a minimal driving force. Mantle convection describes the movement of rock and heat within the mantle, where hot ductile mantle rock rises and cold mantle rock sinks. It seems likely that there is a connection between mantle convection and plate movement, but it's not easily defined. There are different models of mantle convection, and it's still being worked out. So there are forces that resist these driving forces, including collisions and transform resistance, basal drag on the bottom of a plate that is dragged over the asthenosphere. The bottom line is that plate motion occurs where the driving forces are greater than the resisting forces. This is a map of the ages of the Earth's oceanic plates, and this offers a good explanation why we think that slab pull is a major process in the movement of plates, whereas ridge push is relatively minor. If you look at the different colored areas, the colors represent different ages. So red would be oceanic crust that is the youngest, and it's being produced along mid-ocean ridges, like here at the East Pacific Rise, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Mid-Indian Ridge, etc. The color pattern is symmetrical on either side, typical of a mid-ocean ridge seafloor spreading scenario. You can see the age colors get older and older in this direction. So red is the youngest, and yellow is a little bit older, brown is even older, and tan is the oldest. In the Pacific are large areas underlain by similar aged crust. A large area of orange, large areas of yellow, brown, and tan. And what that means is that for that certain interval of time, you're creating that much oceanic crust. In the Atlantic Ocean basin, by contrast, you can see that the stripes are much thinner than their counterparts in the Pacific, which means for that same time interval, you're producing much less oceanic crust. So what's the deal? Well, the difference is in the Pacific, you have subduction zones ringing almost the entire margin, and that's where oceanic crust is being subducted. And so as those slabs go down, they're like anchors pulling on the rest of the plate. And so that's driving the plate movement in the Pacific at rates of 10 centimeters or more a year. In the Atlantic, the only place with a subduction zone is here in the Caribbean and down here in the South Scotia Arc. The rest of this is basically passive margin that lacks any kind of subduction zone. So the mid-ocean ridge is basically pushing out, but it's not creating a whole lot of crust as it does so. So without those subduction zones around the margins of the Atlantic, plate movement rates are much less. Geologic activity is greatest mainly at plate tectonic boundaries. Let me briefly describe each of the major kinds of plate boundary. Convergent plate boundaries are where plates collide and involve compressional tectonic stresses. There are three basic types of convergent boundary, each defined by the type of tectonic plate involved. And they include Oceanic-Oceanic convergent, Oceanic-Continental convergent, and Continental-Continental convergent. Let's look at each one of these in more detail. At Oceanic-Oceanic convergent boundaries, two plates of oceanic lithosphere collide, with one subducting under the other to form a subduction zone. This generates compressional tectonic stress and related structures. And this type of boundary is marked by related shallow to deep focus earthquakes. This map here of earthquake data shows the progression from relatively shallow focus earthquakes to deeper focus earthquakes. And that signifies a subduction zone, which we show in this model here. Note that the colors of these earthquake foci are different than the ones here. They don't correlate here. But basically shallow focus to deep focus earthquakes. Another feature that we also see in Oceanic-Oceanic boundaries is something called an island arc. This downgoing plate, as it goes down, it heats up and water is driven off, and this aids in the melting of the overlying plate, and these magmas may rise and typically erupt on the ocean floor there and building up volcanic mountains, eventually islands, and these volcanic islands will occur in a line called an arc. so island arcs are typical of ocean-ocean plate boundaries. The Aleutian Islands of Alaska are an example of an Oceanic-Oceanic convergent boundary. Here's a map which shows the distribution of active volcanoes in the Aleutian Arc, stretching all the way from the mainland of Alaska to the west along the arc. So let's look at a few of these. Here is Shishaldin, beautiful stratovolcano located in the east-central portion of the arc. Shishaldin is Russian for Siskuk, the Aleut name meaning the mountain which points the way when I am lost. Shishaldin is one of several large stratovolcanoes on Unimak Island and is possibly the most symmetrical cone-shaped large mountain on Earth. At 9,373 feet, Shishaldin is the highest volcanic mountain in the Aleutian Island arc. Here is Pavlov in eruption mode, and it's located a little farther east, and since 1980, Pavlov is one of the most active volcanoes in the United States. And here is Mount Cleveland, part of the Islands of the Four Mountains, and like Pavlov is one of the most active volcanoes in the United States, and is a constant hazard to air traffic. These volcanoes are very similar in size and structure. Let's take a look at one of them. Let's look at Cleveland. Here is Cleveland in eruption mode. And it's a beautiful stratovolcano, like many of those in the Aleutian Arc. Steep-sided, fairly high, although Cleveland isn't necessarily one of the higher volcanic peaks in the Aleutians at 5,675 feet. Typically snow and ice covered. Here with a mantling of fresh volcanic ash. You can see another conical stratovolcano across the way there. These are two of the islands of the Four Mountains. Beautiful island arc volcanoes. To reorient. So we can see the full extent of the Aleutian Arc. There it is. Starting in Alaska, trending southwest, all the way towards the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. This is the Pacific Plate. Its dark blue color there means that it's a very deep ocean. Okay, that's the abyssal seafloor of the northern Pacific, and it is being subducted underneath the North American Plate. This part of the North American Plate is oceanic, and Pacific Plate's oceanic, and so that's why we have the ocean-ocean convergent boundary here, forming an island arc. So Pacific Plate, North American Plate, you can see that it's lighter blue in color here. This portion of the North American Plate is continental shelf. So instead of thousands of feet deep like the Pacific, it's more hundreds of feet deep. So fairly shallow water here in this part of the Bering Sea, and it gets deeper off to the west. Here's the Aleutian Trench, which marks the point where the Pacific Plate is actually subducting underneath the North American Plate. And as it goes down, the magmas are generated and they rise and form the volcanoes of the Aleutian Arc. The Japanese islands are also an example of an Oceanic-Oceanic convergent boundary. This map shows the distribution of the major active volcanoes that make up the islands of Japan. So let's look at a few of them. Here is Sakurajima, a stratovolcano located on the island of Kyushu in the southwestern part of Japan. It is across the bay from a fairly large city, Kagoshima. On the same island of Kyushu, there's Mount Unzen, located just east of the city of Nagasaki. It's part of a stratovolcano and lava dome complex that is active, shown here producing a pyroclastic flow. But of course, there's Mount Fuji, located in the central portion of the country on the main island. Fuji is the classic Japanese volcano, the classic stratovolcano. Beautiful, snow-capped. This is the highest point in Japan at 12,388 feet and is considered one of the 3 holy mountains in Japan. So let's visit Fujiyama. So here's Mount Fuji. Beautiful stratovolcano, conical shape, snow and ice covered summit caldera. Reddish color, oxidized tephra. It is an active volcano. Let's visit the rim. And there we are, the summit area of Mount Fuji and its summit crater. We're along the trail here. Let's go up to the summit itself. We are just below the summit, some of the volcanic rock here. As we hike up the trail, see again the reddish volcanics. Where's everybody going? And we're at the top. People waiting to get their picture at the very top. Let's look at the regional picture for Mount Fuji. Back out here. Overhead view, and we'll go to a tilted view, and then let's zoom out. See more and more of Japan there. All the Japanese islands. There's the Japanese island arc. Here's the Pacific plate, Philippine plate. And these 2 oceanic plates are both subducting underneath Eurasia here. So the northern part of the Japanese arc is formed by the subduction of the Pacific plate underneath Eurasia, whereas the southern part is formed by the subduction of the Philippine plate underneath Eurasia. At Oceanic-Continental convergent boundaries, oceanic lithosphere subducts beneath continental lithosphere and creates what's called a subduction zone. So here we can see the downgoing oceanic lithospheric plate and the overriding continental plate. And there are a number of different features present in this tectonic setting. Overall, compressional stress is the dominant tectonic stress. The earthquake pattern here is the classic subduction zone pattern, where you have a range of earthquake foci depths from shallow focus earthquakes to deeper focus. This is an example of an ocean-continental boundary in South America. With that subduction, there is magma generation, and those magmas can rise and erupt on the overriding plate. In this case, it's a continental plate, so the line of volcanoes that is created, the volcanic arc, is a continental one, a continental volcanic arc. The Cascade Range of western North America is an example of a continental volcanic arc. Here's the geologic situation with a downgoing oceanic plate, and it's subducting underneath a continental plate. In the case of the Cascade Range, this is the Juan de Fuca oceanic plate, and this is the North American continental plate. Let's go to Cascade Range, the western side of North America, and it trends from northern California all the way through Oregon, Washington, and into southern Canada. It's made of a number of large stratovolcanoes and other volcanoes. Here's the one-day Fuji plate, and it is subducting underneath North America. And this is the continental arc that is formed on the North American plate. The Andes Mountains are a significant mountain range in South America, and they also represent a continental volcanic arc. The geologic situation is very similar to that of the Cascades in that you have a subducting oceanic plate beneath a overriding continental plate. In this case, it is the Nazca Oceanic Plate subducting beneath the South American Continental Plate. There are many large volcanic structures, stratovolcanoes, calderas, lava domes, along the whole Andes chain. And if we look at the Andes themselves in their entirety, it is a very long, more or less north-south trending mountain range, stretching all along the western boundary of South America. So this is the Nazca Plate, subducting underneath the South American Plate, forming the Andes, stretching from Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, etc. At continental-continental convergent boundaries, a continental lithospheric plate collides with another continental lithospheric plate. And with the two plates being fairly buoyant, neither one wants to subduct, so no subduction zone forms in this case. There is considerable compressional tectonic stress, which creates large tectonic structures, fault structures of various kinds. But without the subduction zone, there are no deep focus earthquakes. And in fact, the earthquake pattern in a continent-continent tectonic boundary is dominated by shallow focus earthquakes. You can see from this portion of the Himalaya, mostly shallow focus quakes that are either orange or yellow with a smattering of green ones here, but they're still relatively shallow. So shallow focus quakes because there's no subduction. So we lack that typical banded earthquake pattern of a subduction zone here. Because there's no subduction zone, there's very little volcanism. Without that downgoing slab to help generate the magmas, there's no volcanism and no volcanic arc. These make some of the largest mountains on Earth, and these are truly large tectonic mountains. The Himalaya of South Central Asia are a prime example of a tectonic mountain range formed at a continental-continental convergent boundary. Here is the geologic situation. Previous to the continent-continent collision, there must have been subduction, bringing closer and closer the continental portions of one plate with the continental portion of another. In this case, the Indian subplate had continental crust, and it was being eventually subducted towards and underneath the Eurasian continental plate. So this ocean basin was shrinking until finally it was closed altogether, and the Indian subcontinent collided with the southern portion of Eurasia, creating the Himalayan mountain range. These are some of the largest, highest mountains on Earth, including, of course, Mount Everest, the highest mountain, K2, and others. This is a gigantic region in northern India, more or less separating a number of countries. We have Tibet here, China, India. It is a long mountain range stretching from east to west. Let's zoom in on the Nepal portion. These are different than the island arc mountain ranges, which have the beautifully conical stratovolcano mountains. These are tectonic mountains. Of course, one of my favorites as a child was Tintin. Tintin in Tibet was one of the books in that series. These are tracks of the elusive Yellowstone. Divergent plate boundaries are where plates move apart. And there are two basic kinds of divergent boundary defined by the type of plate involved: oceanic divergent and continental divergent boundaries. Oceanic divergent are also called mid-ocean ridges, whereas continental divergent boundaries are termed continental rifts. At oceanic divergent boundaries, two oceanic lithospheric plates are moving away from each other. This type of boundary is also called a mid-ocean ridge. Here's the geologic diagram showing the divergent boundary here, and spreading away from it in either direction are oceanic plates. In this kind of tectonic setting, since we have movement away from each other, the dominant tectonic stress is tension. Because there's no subduction here, the earthquake pattern is typically dominated by shallow focus earthquake. Along the mid-ocean ridge itself, you can see in the mid-Indian ridge here a clustering of very shallow focus quakes, and they neatly define the trend of the mid-ocean ridge. See a total lack of deep focus earthquakes in this tectonic setting. Without subduction, we don't have that style of volcanism, but we do have considerable basaltic volcanism along the rift zone. And this is because of the hot mantle underneath that is rising, and it's hot and it undergoes decompression, and that causes melting, and that melting mantle produces a basaltic style of volcanism. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is an example of a feature formed at an oceanic divergent boundary. Here's a diagram of the northern Atlantic Ocean with the ocean water removed, so you can see the topography of the seafloor. It's exaggerated vertically to highlight some of the topographic features. You can see the Mid-Atlantic Ridge snaking its way down from the Arctic and through Iceland into the northern Atlantic, and then eventually into the southern Atlantic. You can see it's offset by numerous transform faults. When you look at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in profile, it is a very subdued profile. This is to scale. It's a very broad feature. Even though at the ridge axis itself, the elevation above the surrounding abyssal seafloor might be over 1,000 meters, the underwater mountain range is really a low and broad feature. Let's take a look at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and there it is. And this would be it. Offset by transform faults laterally. And it makes its way up to Iceland, which is the only place in the world where a mid-ocean ridge is above sea level. And if you click this link here, there's more information about the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Again, this map here shows the full extent of the ridge. We were just looking at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge in the northern Atlantic, but it continues into the southern Atlantic as well. At continental divergent boundaries, the continental lithosphere spreads apart and forms a rift valley or continental rift. And this shows a cross-section of a divergent continental boundary. Tensional stresses are the dominant stress at this type of plate boundary. And since, again, there's no subduction, shallow focus earthquakes dominate. This is an example of a divergent continental boundary in East Africa. This is the East Africa Rift with its characteristic three-armed shape coming together at one point called a triple junction. That's where the African plate is spreading apart, forming a new smaller plate, the Arabian plate, and in between are two new ocean basins, the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And the East Africa Rift is the third, but it's lagging behind, and typically that's the case. One of the three rift arms will lag behind and actually stop spreading altogether. Again, that's the dominant earthquake activity, is shallow focus earthquakes. There's no subduction here, but since the mantle is rising, you get decompression melting and a lot of mafic volcanism, and those can erupt as basalts, like this volcano here. And sometimes those basaltic magmas interact with the continental crust and melt it, and you'll get felsic magmas. And so you get two different flavors. You get kind of the chocolate-flavored basaltic stuff, and then you'll get the vanilla-flavored granitic magmas. So bimodal, as it's called, bimodal volcanism. If we look at Erta Ale, the name of this volcano, very cool. And so let's zoom in on it. And you can see there's a caldera complex here, lava lake, typical basaltic fissure type eruption. And we can zoom in even more and get a nice close view of the caldera itself. And if we zoom out, we'll see where this is in Africa. There is the East Africa Rift, and this is down towards the triple junction there, and there's the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The East Africa Rift is a great example of a rift formed at a continental divergent boundary. Here is a map of the region showing the major tectonic elements. The EAR is the East Africa Rift, where the African plate is spreading apart. The East Africa Rift is one of 3 rift arms, the other 2 being the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. All come together at one point, called a triple junction. That's where a hotspot is located above a mantle plume, and here it's specifically called the Afar hotspot. They're spreading along all 3 of the rift arms, but it's taking place at a faster rate in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, where oceanic crust is starting to form. It's lagging somewhat in the East Africa Rift region, and that's typical of triple junction rift zone spreading. One of the rift arms lags behind and eventually stops spreading altogether. Here's Erta Ale that we just looked at, situated right on the hotspot. Another noteworthy volcano is Oldoño Lengai, which erupts not silicate lava, but a rare type of lava called carbonatite. And no, that's not what Han Solo was trapped in Empire Strikes Back. There's also the iconic Mount Kilimanjaro, located just below the equator. Here's the summit area of this dormant volcano. Let's visit Mount Kilimanjaro. Really high stratovolcano, summit caldera complex. So let's drag the little person over to the rim. And there we are, in the snow in Africa at the equator. Peeking over into the summit crater there. Some of the other volcanics in the area. So it's right on the border between Tanzania and Kenya. Transform plate boundaries are where plates slide by each other in opposite directions and include both oceanic transforms and continental transforms. This is an example of an oceanic transform. Let's look at oceanic transform boundaries, where separate oceanic plates are moving in opposite directions. These boundaries evolve from the differential spreading along mid-ocean ridges, which eventually cause their offset along transform faults. Here are 2 mid-ocean ridges, with oceanic crust moving to the left, then to the right from this spreading center, and then same mid-ocean ridge, just offset, plate going that way and that way. And so the transform fault is right here, separating these 2 oceanic plates, this one moving to the left and this one moving to the right. This is along the East Pacific Rise. Again, you can see mid-ocean ridge, offset, mid-ocean ridge. So this offset between the 2 ridge segments, that's the transform fault. And this kind of shows how it evolves over time, and it takes hundreds of thousands to a few million years to develop this kind of offset. And that's a cool little model there. The fracture zone is an extension of the transform fault. These faults are no longer active, okay, and they're called fracture zones, and they can be quite extensive in length. East Pacific Rise here, the continuation of that transform fault, this would be a fracture zone here and on the other side as well. Same thing down here and over here. So at these type of tectonic boundaries, shear stress is the dominant tectonic stress, and this results in mainly shallow focus earthquakes. No subduction, so you don't get the suite of deepening earthquake foci. It's dominated by shallow focus quakes, just like mid-ocean ridge segments. These oceanic transforms go hand in hand with those. So this is a map of the East Pacific Rise, and it shows the transform segments are very active with shallow focus earthquake activity. There's very little volcanism taking place along these transform boundaries. The volcanism really is occurring along the mid-ocean ridge segment. So in this block diagram right here and here. But along the transform fault or even the fracture zone, there's very little in the way of any kind of volcanism. The Clipperton fracture zone is an area of the North Pacific that includes transform faults that offset the East Pacific Rise. And here's an earthquake foci map which shows part of the East Pacific Rise coming in like this. You can see offset along that transform and then another transform offset, and here it continues off to the south. This is a slightly different map here where it's not solid color. These are very shallow focus earthquakes made up of different areas. In this case, 4 quadrants, 2 of them colored, 2 of them not. In seismological lingo, that's called a beach ball. And what the different quadrants tell you is what type of stress is involved in creating that earthquake. In this case, they're all pretty much similar in that they're equal sized quadrants, and it tells you that it's basically shear stress of a transform fault. So all these earthquakes are shear related with movement along the transform and the Clipperton fracture zone. This shows a 3-dimensional look at the fracture zone, and so here's one transform, here's the other. This is where the fracture zone is located, south of Central America. Continental transform plate boundaries are where 2 continental lithospheric plates are sliding by each other in opposite directions. In this kind of setting, shear stress is commonly the dominant stress, just as is the case with an oceanic transform boundary. These transform faults can also be described more generally as strike-slip faults. This is because the motion is horizontal in the direction of strike. And we'll describe what strike is a little later, but it basically means that movement is horizontal. A transform fault simply separates 2 tectonic plates on either side. A strike-slip fault is any fault with this horizontal movement in either direction. So strike-slip is a more general term. These can be defined in 2 basic types depending on the relative movement of the other side of the fault. So when you look at these examples, this is a strike-slip fault. If you are standing on this side here looking across at the other side has been moved to the left. So we call that a left lateral strike-slip fault. This example, if we're standing here and the other side has been shifted to the right, that is a right lateral strike-slip fault. Shallow focus earthquakes are the dominant earthquake type, as with oceanic transforms. This is a map of Southern California, and it's fairly diffuse with the number of earthquakes because there's a large number of faults in the area, most of which are strike-slip faults. The continental transform is the San Andreas fault zone, and it continues up from the Gulf of California through the Salton Sea area, through Palm Springs, across into LA, and then up towards San Francisco. So this is the Pacific Plate on the south side or west side, and the North American Plate over here. This side is moving to the left, and this side, the North American Plate, is moving to the right, and this is more specifically a right lateral strike-slip fault. But all these earthquakes are related to numerous strike-slip faults. Volcanism is minimal in this kind of setting. because there's no subduction, there's no hotspot or anything else. There's simply horizontal offset of, in this case, continental lithosphere. The San Andreas Fault is a large right lateral transform fault that separates the Pacific Plate from the North American Plate. Coming up from the Gulf of California through the Salton Sea area, across north of Los Angeles, up towards San Francisco, north of San Francisco, and then off the coast. This shows the cross section, and there are a number of different faults, the Whittier Fault being one. These are important faults, and they're not all strike-slip faults or transform faults. There's thrust faults in here too, locally. It's a little bit more complex, but as the San Andreas interacts with different crustal blocks like the Sierra Nevada and others, it has to deviate around, and that causes changes in the stresses and the types of faults. But in general, the San Andreas is a right lateral transform, with the North American side moving to the right relative to the Pacific side. This shows a cross-section through Southern California here of the transform boundary, and the North American Plate would be the continental lithosphere on the east side, and it's moving toward us, and that's what the circle with the dot is indicating. It's a transform fault, high angle, almost vertical, and this plate is moving toward us, and the circle with the X, that plate is moving away from us. And this is the Pacific Plate, and this is the portion of the Pacific Plate that actually has some continental crust on it. This would be LA right here, and LA is going to be moving farther north, and San Francisco is actually on the North American Plate. With each movement of the San Andreas, those two areas are getting closer and closer. It's thought that maybe in 10 or 15 million years, given continued plate movement, these two areas will be side by side. This is the classic area of the San Andreas. It's very long, and it's got several different segments, but this is the Carrizo Plain segment, which is the part seen in most textbooks, and this is where we see the fault expressed as a kind of a ridge here with these stream segments being offset. Like this stream right here, you can see it's coming in there and then offset. So if we're standing here looking across this way, we can see the stream valley has been offset to our right. And if we look up the way there, we can see the San Andreas forming a linear landform, erosion along the fault zone itself. This would be the North American Plate on the right, moving toward us, and this would be the Pacific Plate on the left, moving away from us. There's plenty of information on the San Andreas transform. It's very well studied and researched. So there's a lot of information on this page, a lot of links about the San Andreas. Intraplate hotspots are areas of magmatic activity that typically occur within a tectonic plate and away from the plate boundary, but not always. These occur within both oceanic and continental plates. This map here shows the distribution of dozens of them. You can see they're spread between continental areas and oceanic areas. Most occur within the plate, like the Pacific Plate here, but some actually occur very close or on a plate boundary, including Iceland, which sits right on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. But most are within the plate, so intraplate. If we go to the web page about hotspots, the hotspot, as we'll talk about, is basically that spot on the Earth's surface above a rising mantle plume. But this page talks all about the origin, and what's really cool is it lists all the major hotspot areas, gives you their locations, and you can click on them and go there and visit them, and it's a lengthy list. Oceanic hotspots are where oceanic lithosphere moves over a mantle plume, and Mantle plumes are thought to be more or less stationary, whereas the tectonic plates are not. And so as the plume interacts with the overlying lithospheric plate, you might have melting, and those magmas rise and erupt onto the surface and form volcanic features of different types. And as the plate moves, it will carry those features off the hotspot and carry them away progressively farther and farther, forming what's called a hotspot trace. These signify the movement of the plate in a certain direction over a hotspot. This is a cross-section of the Hawaiian mantle plume, and this would be the hotspot area on the Pacific plate, and it is centered on the big island of Hawaii currently. So that's where all the active volcanism is, and the Pacific plate is moving to the northwest very slowly, carrying off all these volcanic islands to the northwest. It will be a matter of time before Hawaii moves off the hotspot and volcanism will cease. These other islands like Maui and Molokai and Oahu and Kauai, they formerly sat above the mantle plume at the hotspot, and they were volcanically active millions of years ago, but have since been carried off and volcanism has ceased. And as that has happened, the oceanic crust has cooled and they've subsided. Eventually, if we kept going farther and farther to the northwest, the islands end and those volcanic features are below sea level and they're seamounts. So that's the natural evolution of these intraplate hotspot volcanic islands, is they form at the hotspot and they get carried off and eventually they'll become seamounts. So this type of tectonic setting sees dominantly shallow focus earthquakes. Here's a map of Hawaii, and the earthquake activity is exclusively centered right around the hotspot, and it is all shallow focus in nature. The type of volcanism at these oceanic hotspots is, again, dominantly basaltic or mafic in flavor. So basalt is a common mafic volcanic rock. This is a typical basaltic eruption at Kilauea, where the lava is actually making it to the ocean and blasting into steam and shards of rock and all that. So very exciting. Again, why this is going on is there's a column of hot rock rising in the mantle. It's called a mantle plume. And as it rises to depths that are so shallow, that decompression of the mantle rock causes melting. And it's enough melting to form fairly decent volumes of magma, which then erupt to form volcanoes at the surface. So it's called decompression melting. The Hawaiian Island Emperor Seamount chain is an example of volcanic mountains formed over an intraplate hotspot, specifically the Hawaiian hotspot on the Pacific plate. Here we have a map of the Hawaiian Island chain and the Emperor Seamount chain. Two distinctive hotspot traces. One is more or less west-northwest trending, and the other one is north-northwest trending. Okay, one is made up mostly of volcanic islands, the other one mostly of submerged volcanic mountains or seamounts. So looking at the main Hawaiian islands there, the current hotspot is located right under Hawaii, and that's where the active volcanism is. And it's been active for several 100,000 years. Hawaii is made up of 5 large shield volcanoes, which have erupted over the last few 100,000 years. Before that, the hotspot was located underneath Maui, and before that it was Molokai and Oahu and Kauai, etc. So with time, the Pacific plate has carried each one of those areas off the hotspot towards the northwest, and then volcanic activity has ceased, and it's just a matter of time before wave erosion and cooling of the oceanic lithosphere makes those volcanic islands disappear to become seamounts. So we go all the way over here to Midway and some other little islands there, and then we lose the islands for good, and everything else is submerged until you get up to the Aleutian Trench, where the Pacific plate is subducting underneath North America. People might ask, why is there this bend here? That's a good question. Remember, this is a hotspot trace, and it traces the movement of the overriding plate, in this case the Pacific plate, and its direction over the hotspot. Well, the direction of that plate must have changed, traveling in this direction, but now it is traveling in this direction. The age of these rocks here, around 42 or 43 million, something big must have happened at that point. And we're not talking asteroid impacts or something like that, but a plate tectonic rearrangement of some kind occurred and caused the movement of the Pacific plate to change from a more northerly direction to a more westerly one. These are all different maps of the Hawaiian Island Emperor Seamount chain with dates on the different seamounts and volcanic islands. Here's Mauna Loa. This is the view from Mauna Kea. Mauna Loa is the biggest single mountain on Earth. It's about 30,000 feet or so from its base at the seafloor to its summit. It's a big shield volcano. And it is active, and when you look at pictures of Hawaii, it is the most prominent of the volcanic mountains. Down there, here's Mauna Loa. Mauna Kea is the next higher one over here to the north. Look at the summit area. Lava flows emanating off from the summit area and from fissure zones and along the flanks of the mountain there. So it's a large shield volcano complex that makes up the big island of Hawaii. Intraplate hotspots also occur where continental lithosphere is overriding a mantle plume. And this shows a simplified cross-section of a continental hotspot with the top of a mantle plume interacting with the continental tectonic plate. Shallow focus earthquakes are the dominant type in this area, as with oceanic hotspots. This is a map of Yellowstone National Park in northwestern Wyoming, and you can see the considerable density of shallow focus earthquakes there. This decompression melting of the top of the mantle plume here yields what's called bimodal volcanism, because this melting of mantle material produces this mafic magma, which typically either erupts straight out as a basaltic lava flow or interacts with the continental crust, melts it, and melted continental crust might form a more felsic magma, which then would erupt as a rhyolite. And so two fundamentally different flavors of volcanic rock: basalt, rhyolite, chocolate, vanilla. So we call that bimodal volcanism. The melting of the continental crust causes felsic volcanism, and it's fundamentally different than basaltic volcanism, as we'll talk about later. Felsic volcanism is much more explosive, typically a lot less lava. There's a lot more volcanic ash produced, and that ash could be blown into the atmosphere and carried around the world, or it might come back down right around the volcanic vent. So this volcanic ash or volcanic tuff is seen in many places around Yellowstone, and this is a great place to look along the Yellowstone River, and this is the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And all these light-colored rocks are rhyolitic volcanics. See, it's a beautiful area, Yellowstone. There are many different volcanic features to look at, and this is the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone portion. And it's cutting through the Yellowstone Plateau, which is mantled by lots of felsic volcanics. There's many different viewpoints from which to take advantage of these different vistas, and we back out. You can see the broader area of Yellowstone. This whole area right here is over the intraplate hotspot. Well, the Yellowstone mantle plume produces the Yellowstone hotspot on the North American plate. And so Yellowstone is a classic continental intraplate hotspot. Here is a cross-section showing the continental lithosphere of the North American plate, rising basaltic magma from the mantle plume, and it's interacting with the crust, and it's forming that bimodal volcanism we talked about. One thing that happens again with this intraplate volcanic activity and crustal melting, calderas, below which is the magma chamber, and as the magma gets vented out and as the ash gets blasted in the atmosphere, the floor of the caldera lowers along these faults. Yellowstone itself is composed of this kind of structure. The position of Yellowstone today is right here in northwestern Wyoming, and these volcanics are a few 100,000 years old or so to a few million years old, and Just like there's oceanic hotspot trace with the Hawaiian Islands and Emperor Seamounts, you can have hotspot traces on continental lithosphere. And indeed, that's what we have with the Yellowstone hotspot. And if we look to the southwest, we see a progression of older and older volcanics, 4 million, 6 million, 10 million, 12 million or so. This is the Yellowstone hotspot trace. And it gets all the way through southern Idaho, the Snake River Plain, all the way over into Oregon. This is the North American plates movement over the Yellowstone mantle plume for the last 15 million years or so. The volcanic activity that occurs with these hotspots like Yellowstone, lots of explosive volcanism, lots of pyroclastic volcanism. So not as much lava, but more ash thrown into the atmosphere. And these are very large volume eruptions in terms of how much volcanic ash is thrown out. To compare, here is Mount St. Helens, which is less than a cubic kilometer of ash blown into the atmosphere, of tephra as it's called. So anything blown up into the atmosphere. A cubic kilometer, that still sounds like a lot, but that's what Mount St. Helens erupted. Well, some of these other eruptions have happened through time, and Yellowstone is just one area where this has occurred. A million years ago, the Mesa Falls eruption, 280 cubic kilometers, 280 times or more that of Mount St. Helens. You look at the Lava Creek eruption 600,000 years ago. That was 1,000 cubic kilometers. Look at the Huckleberry Ridge one 2 million years ago. That was 2,500 cubic kilometers. Massive eruptions, none of which have ever happened during recorded history, and it's a good thing. This big one here is Toba. That was in the southwestern Pacific 75,000 years ago or so. One last thing, look at the timing of these. Huckleberry Ridge is the biggest one, 2 million. And then there was Mesa Falls, 1.3, so about 700,000 or 800,000 years. And then Lava Creek, and this one was about 700,000 years or so from this one, a little bit less. And so if there's a fourth one, it should be happening any time now. And that's what has people studying Yellowstone very closely, because it is thermally active. There's magma down there. And if we just look at the cycle, we are pretty much in that period where this kind of eruption could occur. Well, that's all for now. Till next time.